Hey everyone, I'm Gwen from Nile, and today I want to show you how to use Nile with PrismaORM. So, in case you don't know, Nile is a serverless database for modern SaaS, and as you definitely know, SaaS is typically a multi-tenant application. So, Nile provides what we call tenant virtualization, which basically means that we provide every tenant with its own virtual database. And it's a database, so you can back it up separately, you can restore it separately, you can place it on its own dedicated machine, you can place it in a different continent. Basically, treat it like its own database without any tricky scripts. You get security, you get isolation, you don't really need to deal with all those access rules. But you get the same experience as a single database. So as a developer, you can go and run queries. Normally, you don't have the overhead of having to deal and manage thousands of databases. Since Nile is a database, and you presumably are a developer, then we figured you may want to use Nile with your favorite ORM. And if this is happen to be Prisma, then this video happened to be for you. In the video, we're going to go over an example application that uses Prisma to access the database in Nile, and we'll have some tenants and they'll have data, and you'll see how to query data for each tenant securely. And by the end of the video, you will know enough in order to go and build your own application and do this yourself. We're going to go over a few things. First, I'm going to show you how to set up your database in Nile. Then I'll show you how to clone the example and how to run it locally so you can play around with it. And then we'll go to the code editor and I'll walk you step by step through how I build the example, and especially focusing on how I use PrismaORM to run queries against virtual tenant databases in Nile. So let's get to it. Okay, so step number 1, log into Nile and create a database. I already have a database here, but for the sake of the demo, let us create a new one. Debonair Plain it is. Okay, so you can see that our database got created. It has green status, all is well. Let's go in. Okay, so one thing to notice is that even though it's a brand new database that I just created from scratch, it already had some tables. So those are called built-in tables. And the idea is that some things in SaaS are just so common that we figured we will create them for you and save you a bit of work. So we have here the tenants table, and you can see some columns, you can have tenant names. So you have this, and if you browse around, you'll be able to see that we have few more of those schemas and few more of those built-in tables. You can read all about them in our documentation. Now, time to create the tables for our application, right? So let's do that. And it's a to-do list application. Therefore, I'm going to create a to-dos table to store them in. Okay, went well, successful, and I have the to-dos table. So one of the columns worth paying attention to is the tenant ID column. And this column is the relation to the tenants table, but it also makes this table tenant aware, meaning that every row that is in this table will belong to a specific tenant. And because it belongs to a specific tenant, when we set the context to be for this virtual tenant database, you will only see rows that belong to that tenant and not any other rows in this table. So you can think of this table as also being virtualized into all those virtual databases. This is more or less all we had to do in the Nile console. One more thing, we're going to have to connect to this database from our application, so we need to grab a connection string. We go to settings, we have connections, And we're going to get it for this one. Click on Generate Credentials. And now you have a connection string. Copy it, save it securely. You're going to need it very soon. Okay, with that done, let's go to the command line, clone the example, and try to run it locally. Okay, so go into this directory and start by cloning the example. So okay, looks like we got it. And now we need the environment. So we have an example environment file. We're going to rename it. And then you can see that there is some kind of an example connection string. You're going to paste the ones that you grabbed just a second ago from the Nile console. Here we are. Cool. Now, as usual, we're going to install our dependencies and run the application. It should be running. Now, let's try a few things with it. This is a backend application, so I'm going to try a few things using curl. Okay, so I'm running this command, which is supposed to create a tenant called my first customer. Okay, and this indicates that it indeed worked. Now we can also list the tenants. And this is all stuff that my application, this RESTful backend, is doing using Nile database. So we can create another tenant, can create some to-dos, and then I can list to-dos for one of the tenants. Ooh, forgot the user. Oh, I created both to-dos for the same tenant. So now I have to create another to-do for the different tenant in order for you not to think that I am lying about isolation. So let me create another to-do. Okay, so it got created, but if I go back and try to list again, you can see that I still only have the first two to-dos. Okay, so now that you've seen what this application is doing, let's go to the code and see how it's doing what it's doing. So first of all, one thing to be aware using Prisma is that you need to generate a Prisma client that is aware of your data model. So this example, we have just cloned it and it works. But normally, after you do all the create table commands and all that, what you want to do is something like this. So let's stop the application for now. What you want to do is do npx prisma pool. This will connect to the database. This is after you configured Prisma's connection to the database. It introspects the database and it creates a data model in Prisma's own language that represents what we have in the database. So this is the command. I'm not going to run it right now because we have already done that. And then the second thing you want to do is npx prisma generate. What this does is take this schema file and generate a client from that. So now you have a client which is type aware, it's object oriented. I'll show you how to use it. So this is important. If you try using Prisma with your own code, read a Prisma doc to understand a bit more what this means, when you should use introspection, and how to evolve the schema going forward, because this is all pretty specific to Prisma. So now that we got the client generation out of the way, let me show you how the code looks like using this client. Okay, so first of all, this is what the Prisma schema file looks like. And you can see that we have the tenant schema here, and we have the to-dos, and everything we've just talked about, it all appears here. Then if you go to our main application file, you can see that we are importing, for example, things from Prisma client, and we have a Prisma client object. So this is the first step for using Prisma. Let's look at what querying with a Prisma client looks like. So we're going to skip down. Yeah, so for example, when we did get all tasks, all the to-dos for a specific tenant, the query that we ran was the tenantDB Prisma client, to-dos table that refers back to the model, so it's part of the client, and we just say find many without any other parameters or filters. Just give us everything you find. Why? Because we connected to a virtual tenant database, and everything you find is everything that belongs to that tenant. It will never include anything that belongs to any other tenant because we made this connection specifically. And you can see that this is also the same when we do updates. For example, we don't need to specify which tenant ID we are updating. Okay, so now that we know how to query Prisma, let's take a look at the part that really makes the magic work, which is the tenant context. So we're doing two things here, and I'm going to start with the Express middleware. So we're using Express as our application framework in Node.js. What we want to do is for every request that comes in, check if there is a tenant ID. In this case, we put it in the path, but you can put it in a cookie, in a header, any place that you feel like putting tenant IDs. We grab the tenant ID, and then we say create a Prisma client for that specific tenant ID. What's going on here is two things. First of all, tenant context is what is also known in Node.js as async storage. So you can see that we are using async local storage. And this allows us to store things that will be available for us for the lifetime of the request. So after this middleware runs, we're going to run the request handler. The request handler will run with this context and will have access to the Prisma client that is already initialized to this specific tenant. So this is an important part. We initialize this context that will be available in the next step in the request handler itself. Now, the getting a connection to the virtual tenant database, we're using a tenantDB extension, which is an extension. This is the extension. So nice thing about Prisma is that it's very extensible, and you can say, take the normal client, but before running a query, I want to do a few more things. And in this case, before we run a query on any of the models, meaning tenants, to-dos, if we had other tables, it would apply to other tables, and to any operation, insert, update, delete, all those. Before you do any of that, start a transaction. And in that transaction, set the Nile tenant ID to the tenant ID we previously grabbed from the request path, but you can grab from the headers as well. And if we don't have a tenant ID, make sure that Nile doesn't think we have a tenant ID. So disconnect from the specific tenant database and get back to the general Nile context. So we're basically saying before you're running any query, start a transaction and set the context. This guarantees that the connection pool is not going to switch up a connection on us because we're in the middle of a transaction. You're not allowed to switch up connections, and everything will happen within this context. So this is literally it. That's how it works. In order to do something in a tenant context, you grab the tenant from the request, initialize a connection using the tenantDB extension, which basically says before you're running all those queries, set the tenant ID and Nile, and that's it. Nile takes care of the rest, and you don't need to specify where clauses in any of your queries because the middleware have taken care of setting the correct context for you, and it makes sure everything is already safe. If you want to try something unsafe, we have also an example of using the insecure endpoint. Note that here the path does not contain a tenant ID, what makes it insecure. We deliberately skip the tenant context. So even though it says tenantDB and get tenant context and the code looks like it's the same, because we have not supplied a tenant ID, it's going to run across the entire system. This is it. Write an application, use a Prisma extension, use Express middleware, and you too have access to virtualized tenant databases. Okay, so this is it. To sum things up, you now have a nice little to-do list application written with NodeJS, Express, PrismaORM, and Nile database supplying the tenant isolation and virtualization. As next steps, if you have not done it yet, I encourage you to try it out yourself. Clone the example, read a doc, play around with it, get a bit comfortable, make some modifications, make it your own. And then, next thing, write your own really awesome SaaS application and join the Nile community on our Discord or via GitHub and tell us about it so we can either answer your questions or celebrate the awesome SaaS application you've written with you. We love hearing about use cases and stories. Thank you very much.